Does Bdote sound familiar to you somehow? That word is kind of mispronounced nowadays, and it's called Mendota. Right? So Bdote was the original word.
I like to say that my homeland, where I'm really from, is right here in this beautiful river valley. This is the place where the Dakota called home for thousands of years. And so welcome. Yahi Bikimashite. It's good that you came.
We're in close proximity to an area known as Bdote, which is the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers down here in the background in front of Fort Snelling. And what Bdote literally means is the veins in your neck that cause you to be able to breathe. And so anyone that's born here in Minnesota, their first breath was taken of this air from Bdote, this air that came from the beginning of the Dakota Nation, the same soil that makes Bdote, that red earth there. That's what's in us as Dakota people. That's the very essence of our being. And to Dakota people, it's a vortex of power. It's a spot where our nation was made, but it's also a spot where genocide was perpetrated against our people at Fort Snelling. So it's a place of happiness and of sadness. But to Dakota people today, it's still a sacred spot to visit despite the highway, despite the proximity to the airport. We can still hold ceremonies and remember our ancestors there today.
At historic Fort Snelling. This is a place that is a really popular spot for teachers to bring students. A really important counter story to this up here in the westward expansion is, what about where we're standing? What about this sacred place to the Dakota? And also to people who live here in Minnesota. What is our connection to the land, and how is that important? Because as teachers, we really want to teach our students not only about the history and the true history, but also teaching them to become good critical thinkers.
18 years ago, at that time I was a Dakota Hokshida, just a Dakota boy at that time. And when I came to the fort, I was met by the soldiers at the front entrance, and I was told all about the Civil War. Told all about the importance of this fort to settler society. But when I left, I realized I was experiencing a cognitive dissonance. I didn't even know the term at that age, but I understood the feeling that what I was being told didn't parallel what actually happened at this place, what this place represented to my family, my ancestors, and to me as a Dakota man living today. But as I return as a Dakota man, a Dakota Wichashta, I have the awareness and the understanding of what this place really means through my own connections to Bdote, of what Fort Snelling is, where it stands, and what it symbolizes to my people. And so when Fort Snelling first began in the 1820s, it was to try to gain control of the river economy from the Dakota. My ancestors, the Bidewakantuan, were living at Kapoja and various other village sites along the Mississippi River from Mille Lacs all the way down to past Prairie Island, or what we know as Prairie Island, Tintawita today. And because we controlled this river economy, the soldiers, they had to do something about it. So they had the Zebulon Pike Treaty established in 1805, and future treaties to increase the size of this fort and increase the dominion of what would now be known as Minnesota, or Minnesota. But to Dakota people, this is still one of the most important places on the planet, Makacho Kayaking, the center of the earth. It's the center of our being. And not only is it the center of the earth, but it's our mirror image of Wanachi Tachanku, the road of ghosts above us. Today, while I'm talking, the moon is still out above us, and so is the sun. So it's a great day to be out here and talking. I know my ancestors are here with us. And when I come to Fort Snelling today, I remember the people that were imprisoned beneath the fort, but I also remember Jacques Pédant and Wakan Ojanjan, who were hung here. They're hung somewhere in this fort, but Washichu history has erased exactly where from our knowing and from our being, but as Dakota people, we still remember them today whenever we're here.
our grandmothers and women and children were rounded up in Lower Sioux, Morton, Minnesota, at the Lower Sioux Agency. And there were over 2,000 women and children and elders who were rounded up and force marched here to Fort Snelling, to a concentration camp. And along the way, it was 150 miles march, forced march, and our grandmothers were forced to walk about 25 miles a day under really harsh conditions. It was November, and we know what November is like in Minnesota. Some had no shoes. Many had no food to eat. It was no blankets or any way to keep warm. And they were brought here to a concentration camp right down the hill here. There's many pictures of that camp. And every time I see them, I think about my own great-great-grandmother, Pazahiyayuing, who on the evening before they started that walk had a baby. Her name was Wanske. And she had a baby, and so she walked with that baby and her children here to Fort Snelling. And I wonder how that must have been for her, and how difficult that must have been for the elders to make that walk. This place is so sacred to the Dakota that we would come here to have our children. And for Pazahiyayuing, she actually did come here to birth her son, who at the time on that walk was between 2 and 3 years old. And so for him to have been born here in such a sacred manner, and then to have been brought back to a concentration camp. 300 died in the course of just a few months once they got here. And so it's a really bittersweet place, a place that people should know the history. In 2002, some Dakota women and people, I should say, got together and decided to that the only way we could heal from those events, because coming here makes us so sad, is to walk in the footsteps of our ancestors. And that's really was kind of the way we described it. And the idea was to acknowledge their suffering, to acknowledge the history and their story, and to heal. And as Dakota people, if we could heal from that, we could find our way back to this sacred place in a good way, with our hearts not so heavy. And that's still hard for me to do today. But we did recreate the walk. Many, many women and children and men have walked that over the last 10 years. The longer we've done it, it seems the more that we are standing strong in who we are.
So according to documents at the Minnesota Historical Society, the last time Dakota people lived freely here at Coldwater Spring was around 1858 in the summer. And we were camped with some Ojibwe and of the Mille Lacs Ojibwe Wolf Clan. And the Dakota people were here holding ceremony, the Wakanwa Chipi, or the medicine lodge, around this spring here, and using the water from this sacred site to hold the ceremony, and so that the people would live off the water that comes from this spring, because it's considered medicine water, because it flows freely from the earth at a cold temperature year-round and doesn't freeze. In Dakota we call it Mini Owe Sni, so Coldwater Spring, or the water, cold water with tracks. So you can see it coming out of the earth.
So how long has this structure been here, this small structure?
Since the mid-1800s. I don't know the exact date, but when you look at the oldest photos you can find of this area of Coldwater Spring, they feature this structure in it as the primary focus, as if the water isn't important. They focus on the structure more than the spring itself. Those are just some of the photos I've seen at the Minnesota Historical Society. But you can also find these interesting writings, like I was talking about in 1858 where we met. They said there was just a huge ceremony taking place here. I can always picture it when I'm here, all these people gathering, laughing, eating, dancing, singing. Just gives me a good feeling to think about that. Contrary to that popular opinion, we know that when our people did battle, it was 1 or 2 people being killed, or 3. It was a family affair. It wasn't a all-out warfare. Thousands of people weren't being slaughtered. And our ancestors cried over every kill they had to make in battle. It wasn't something they enjoyed doing. It was terrible. And they recognized that, and they made peace here. And this is an important place to remember. It's somewhere that we came to make peace, but also, more importantly, to make relations with ourselves, with the earth, and with our other relatives, the plants, animals, and other two-leggeds. That's where our ancestors are still buried. So our ancestors are still in these mounds today. These mounds are sacred to us for a variety of reasons. The soil comes from all over Turtle Island, from South America, from Alaska, from the Yukon. The dirt was hauled by hand and brought here. So wherever these mounds are, when we first built them thousands of years ago, and up until the 1800s, we dig down as far deep as they go. So as tall as they are also dug deep into the earth and then filled with red clay. And that was packed down. And then that soil that was brought from all of the 4 directions all over Turtle Island. So when you go to Dakota ceremonies, like a sweat lodge, they say, Mini wichoni ga wichozani, water is health and life. And that manifests itself here. This water is our life source for Dakota people. This is the water that runs through all of our veins right here. And so it's a site that young and old come to, especially I feel like the young Dakota people need to be aware of this, but also the people that aren't Dakota that live here and in and around these places. It's our responsibility to protect these sites and to keep like trash out of here. If you look around, there's trash in here. Why would we want to be surrounded by dirty water, you know? Whether we're Dakota or not, none of us like dirty water. So that's one thing to be aware of, is when you go to these sites, look how polluted they are. You'll notice they're extremely polluted, and it's really a sad thing to come here and see that. We can't drink from this water, we can't use it for ceremony anymore. But if you bring students here, one thing to be aware of is a lot of Dakota people will be fair ties. You want to make sure no one's disturbing or touching or anything like that. This area here in Dakota, we call it Ohea Wahi, and that name was given to this place by Chris Leith, who's an elder from the Prairie Island community. And that means the hill that's much visited. And so if you spend some time wondering why this hill was visited so frequently, it was because our ancestors would bury the dead here. This is an ancient burial site for Dakota people. For thousands of generations, we'd bring our dead from Carver's Cave or Kapoja village where Chief Little Crow lived, and we'd scaffold them here as a permanent resting place on this hill. So for generations, we've not only used this as a burial site, but you can see far off into the horizon, far off into the distance, and you can see many other Dakota sacred sites, such as Bdote in front of Fort Snelling. And before the buildings were placed there in the bridge, you'd be able to see all the way to Lake Calhoun, which we call Icheata, or the village that's way far back away from the river. That was Cloudman's village. And the Dakota that lived here in this region were able to communicate across various Dakota communities from this vantage point and the areas on the horizon. So this was an area of communication. It was an area to remember your dead, but it was also a place of life. We could gather our food, our medicines, and we could thrive in this area. And hopefully with more understanding about this area, the Dakota people can thrive again at Pilot Knob Hill or Ohea Wahi, the hill much visited. Another name that we have for it is Wodakuye Paha, which is the hill of our ancestors. So whenever we come here, or whenever anyone comes here, Just please remember that it's a sacred spot to Dakota people, and it's no different than going to any other cemetery around the state or around the world. Wopira tanka e chichiapi. I thank you all for listening.
And at the beginning of this tour, we saw where our creation story is, and it's just down along the river here. And that's where we come from. And these are sacred sites to us. And so part of this tour, the importance of this tour is seeing the other part of the story that you probably don't always hear in the classroom. Not the story about westward expansion, but what's the beauty of the place that you are from? What happened here? What's the history here? And how much can you learn just by being in this place and by creating relationships, not just with one another, but with the land.